Shaq walked into the luxury real estate office, ready to invest in the community, when the developer smirked and said, "Sorry, but we don't sell to people like you." The air grew thick with tension. The receptionist swallowed hard. Eyes darted around the room. But instead of getting angry, Shaq grinned. Because what happened next didn't just prove the developer wrong, it shattered his ego, destroyed his empire, and turned the entire city against him in the most legendary way possible. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The scent of polished mahogany and expensive cologne lingered in the air as Shaq stepped into the opulent office of Sterling Properties. The place screamed wealth. Marble floors gleamed under the recessed lighting. Abstract art hung pretentiously on the walls, and a grand chandelier sparkled above. But Shaq wasn't here to admire the decor. He was here to make a deal, one that could change lives. As he approached the reception desk, the young woman sitting behind it flicked her gaze up at him, her polite smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She quickly composed herself. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you have an appointment?" "Yeah," Shaq replied smoothly, his deep voice carrying confidence. "I'm here to see Richard Sterling about the Riverside property." The receptionist hesitated before picking up the phone. "One moment, please." A few seconds later, the heavy oak doors at the back of the office swung open, and out stepped Richard Sterling himself. The man carried the look of old money, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a tailored navy suit hugging his stocky frame, and an expression that managed to be both polite and condescending. "Ah, Mr. O'Neill," Sterling greeted, extending his hand with a tight-lipped smile. "Pleasure to meet you." Shaq shook his hand firmly, his grip strong enough to make the other man subtly shift his stance. "Likewise," Shaq said. "I'm interested in your Riverside building. I want to buy it." For a split second, something unreadable flashed across Sterling's face before he forced out a chuckle. "Oh, that property? I'm afraid it's not for sale." Shaq arched a brow. "That's strange. Your website says otherwise." Sterling leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "Ah, well, that must be an oversight. The truth is, I've decided to hold on to it. It's just not the right time to sell." Shaq studied him, sensing something beneath the words. "That's disappointing. I was planning to turn it into affordable housing for the community." A flicker of distaste crossed Sterling's face before he quickly masked it with another smirk. "Yes, well, that area has potential. But let's be real, Mr. O'Neill. I don't think you're the right kind of buyer for this place." Silence hung between them. Shaq's expression darkened slightly. "The right kind?" Sterling's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with unspoken meaning. "You know exactly what I mean." Shaq clenched his jaw. "Oh, I see how this is gonna go." Shaq's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in the air, like the weight of the conversation had finally settled into its true form. He wasn't just here to buy a building anymore. He was staring into the face of something uglier, something far too familiar. Richard Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming lazily against the polished mahogany desk between them. The smirk on his face was smug, confident, like a man who had played this game before and always won. "Look," Richard finally said, exhaling like this was all a minor inconvenience. "I know your type. Big names, big pockets, big ideas. But let's be honest, you'll turn that place into low-income housing, fill it with Section 8 tenants, and drive down property values. That's not exactly what I'm looking for in a buyer." Shaq didn't react right away. He just stared, his large hands resting on the armrests of the sleek, overpriced chair he sat in. He wasn't a man who let words rattle him, but there was something about the casualness of Sterling's tone, like he wasn't even trying to hide what he was saying, that made Shaq's jaw clench slightly. "You mean helping struggling families?" Shaq asked, his deep voice calm but firm. Sterling shrugged, completely unbothered. "Call it what you want. I have a reputation to maintain, and frankly, I don't see how selling to you benefits me." Shaq let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, like he was absorbing every word, letting it settle. Then he leaned forward, planting his forearms on the desk, making sure Sterling had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You have two options," Shaq said, his voice dropping lower. "Sell it to me now, or I'll make you wish you had." Sterling chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. "You think you can intimidate me?" He spread his arms like he was inviting Shaq to do his worst. "Go ahead, try me." "Shaq, let the silence stretch. then pushed himself up from the chair, towering over Sterling's desk. His massive frame cast a shadow across the room as he adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. Then, with a slow nod, he smirked. "All right," Shaq said, his voice like thunder. "Let's play." Richard's smirk twitched, but for the first time there was uncertainty in his eyes. Shaq wasn't the type to take no for an answer, especially when he knew the real reason behind it. So instead of confronting Richard again, he decided to play it smart. He had his team send in an anonymous offer through a shell company, one that had no ties to him whatsoever. The offer was well over market price, something any reasonable seller would jump at. But when the response came back, it was the same as before. Rejected, no counteroffer, no explanation, just a flat-out refusal. That's when Shaq knew. This wasn't about business. It never was. Determined to dig deeper, he reached out to a fellow investor, an old friend in the real estate game. They met over lunch at a high-end restaurant downtown. But the moment Shaq mentioned Richard Sterling, his friend let out a knowing sigh. "That guy?" The investor shook his head. "Listen, Shaq, I don't know why you're wasting your time. That man doesn't sell to minorities. Period. He's got a history of turning down offers from Black and Hispanic buyers, even when the price is right." Shaq leaned back in his chair, gripping his glass of water a little tighter. "So it's not just me?" His friend gave him a look. "Man, I hate to say it, but Sterling's been gatekeeping that whole neighborhood for years, blocking people like us from getting a foothold. You wouldn't be the first to try. Just the biggest name." Shaq exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the revelation settle. He thought this was just one man's ignorance standing in the way of progress. But it was bigger than that. Sterling was holding an entire community hostage, deciding who was allowed to invest and who wasn't. And that made it personal. Shaq's lips curled into a slow, knowing grin as he drummed his fingers against the table. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Time to change the game." His friend raised an eyebrow. "Shaq, what are you about to do?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, his mind already working a few steps ahead. Richard Sterling thought he could play gatekeeper, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. This wasn't just a rich man throwing money around. Shaq was a strategist, and right now he was about to set the perfect trap. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He had built a network of powerful allies, and now was the time to use them. The first call went to his lawyer, Marcus, a sharp-witted man who specialized in high-profile acquisitions. "Marcus," Shaq said, his tone calm but firm, "I need to buy a building." Marcus chuckled. "You buy buildings all the time, big man. What's the problem?" "The problem," Shaq said, glancing out the restaurant window, "is that the seller is a racist who won't do business with me." There was a pause on the other end before Marcus let out a knowing sigh. "Richard Sterling." "Bingo." Another pause, then a low whistle. "So, what's the play?" Shaq smirked. "We make sure he never sees me coming." A few minutes later, Shaq was on a second call, this time to his business partner, Jordan Fields, a brilliant investor who knew every trick in the book when it came to real estate deals. Jordan listened as Shaq laid out the situation, and by the end of it, he was already grinning. "Oh, I've got an idea," Jordan said. "We set up a brand new entity, completely separate from your name. A shell company. On paper, it's owned by a clean-cut corporate exec, someone who fits the type Richard loves doing business with." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And you know just the guy?" Jordan laughed. "Oh, I know the perfect guy. A Harvard-educated, country club-attending, old money type. We'll make Sterling think he's dealing with his dream buyer." Shaq nodded in approval. This wasn't just a workaround. It was poetic justice. Sterling would have no choice but to sell to someone he thought belonged in his world, only to realize too late that he had handed the keys right into Shaq's hands. Within 24 hours, the paperwork was filed. A new company, Stonebridge Holdings, was officially registered. Its CEO, a well-spoken, impeccably dressed businessman named Jonathan Hayes. What Sterling didn't know, Jonathan Hayes was an actor, hand-picked by Jordan, and paid handsomely to play the role. The offer was made, just like before. But this time, there would be no rejection. Richard Sterling smiled as he reviewed the offer, having no idea he had just walked straight into Shaq's trap. Richard Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, sipping an overpriced espresso as he flipped through the purchase agreement. The numbers were good, better than he'd expected, actually. The buyer, Stonebridge Holdings had offered well above market value for the Riverside property, and the paperwork was airtight. He smirked. Finally, someone who understood the worth of real estate. Now this is more like it, Richard muttered, signing the first page. Across the room, his assistant, Lisa, stood with a neutral expression, waiting for his signal. She had been with him long enough to know that when Richard was in a good mood, it never lasted long. This guy, what's his name again? Hayes? Richard asked, glancing at the documents. Jonathan Hayes, Lisa replied. CEO of Stonebridge Holdings. Richard nodded in satisfaction. A well-dressed, well-connected businessman with a pristine financial record. Exactly the kind of buyer he liked. No headaches, no low-income housing projects, no ruining the neighborhood. Just money, power, and exclusivity. His three favorite things. He flipped to the final page, clicking his pen. All right, let's close this deal. But just as his pen touched the paper, Lisa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. Sir? Richard sighed. What now? Lisa hesitated before stepping forward, lowering her voice. I just got an urgent email from the research team. Richard rolled his eyes. Lisa, I don't need research. I need signatures. No, sir, you do, she insisted, placing the phone in front of him. The subject line made his blood run cold. Buyer investigation report, urgent. Richard's smirk faded as he skimmed the email. His fingers tightened around the phone. Stonebridge Holdings is a front. The real buyer is Shaquille O'Neal. His heart pounded. This has to be a mistake. Lisa shook her head. It's not. They traced the money back to him. Shaq owns the holding company. Richard's face turned bright red as he shot up from his chair, the papers flying off his desk. Deal's off. Across the city, Shaq got the news and simply grinned. Oh, you're not getting out of this that easy. Richard Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk, staring out the window of his high-rise office. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished wood, his mind racing with frustration. For years, he had controlled who bought and sold in this city, ensuring that only the right kind of investors maintained power. But now Shaquille O'Neal had slipped through the cracks, outmaneuvering him in a way he hadn't expected. The Riverside property had been his for years, a key piece of land he never intended to let fall into the hands of someone like Shaq. His assistant, Lisa, stood hesitantly by the door, shifting the tablet in her hands. Sir, it's official. Stonebridge Holdings owns the Riverside building now. You signed off on the sale. Her voice was careful, as if she knew the storm that was about to come. Richard's jaw clenched. He turned to her slowly, his expression cold. I don't care what I signed. There's always a way out. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his neatly combed silver hair before standing up. His movements were deliberate as he walked over to his bookshelf, reaching for a small black notebook filled with names. People who owed him favors, people who could make things happen behind the scenes. Lisa swallowed hard. Sir, the contracts are legally binding. If you try to back out now, Richard cut her off with a smirk. Lisa, I'm not backing out. I'm just making sure our dear friend Shaq realizes that owning a building and actually using it the way he wants are two very different things. He picked up his phone, dialed a number, and leaned against his desk. His voice took on a smooth, practiced tone as soon as the call connected. Councilman Reeves, he said with a chuckle, how's my favorite city official doing today? There was a brief pause before a deep voice answered, wary but intrigued. Richard, what do you need? Richard walked back to his chair and sat down, reclining comfortably. It's about the Riverside property. I have reason to believe it's about to be turned into, well, let's just say, something that doesn't align with our city's vision. Reeves sighed on the other end. You mean affordable housing? Richard let out a light laugh. Exactly. And we both know what that will do to the value of the surrounding properties. We wouldn't want that, would we? A silence stretched between them before Reeves finally muttered, I might be able to push something through. Zoning issues, environmental regulations, safety code violations. You know how it works. But it won't be cheap. Richard's smirk widened. Just name your price. I don't care what it takes. I just need it done. That building can sit empty for all I care. But Shaquille O'Neal will not turn it into some charity project. The next morning, Richard sat at his desk, sipping his coffee as a news alert popped up on his screen. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he read the headline, Breaking, City Council, Blocks Riverside Project, Due to Zoning Issues. Development halted indefinitely. He leaned back, in his chair, exhaling contentedly. Let's see you fix this, big guy. Across town, Shaq's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, reading the headline with a slow, deep breath. A sharp exhale followed before he cracked his knuckles, a knowing smirk forming on his lips. All right, you want to play dirty? Let's play. Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the headline on his phone, his expression unreadable. The city had officially blocked his project, claiming zoning issues and safety concerns. But he knew exactly what this was. Richard Sterling had played dirty, pulling strings with city officials to ensure the Riverside building sat vacant rather than becoming a home for struggling families. A slow exhale left Shaq's lips as he placed his phone down on the table. He wasn't angry. He was focused. If Sterling wanted to play dirty, fine. Shaq had played in tougher courts than this. And unlike Sterling, he didn't cut corners. He made calls, real calls, the kind that could flip a city upside down. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing at one name before pressing call. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. Shaq? Been a while. Mayor Daniels, Shaq said smoothly, his tone calm but firm. I need a favor. The mayor chuckled. You know you don't have to ask like that. What's going on? Shaq picked up a folder from his desk, one he had been saving for the right moment. Richard Sterling. He just got the city to shut down my project, but I have a feeling that ain't the only thing he's been pulling strings for. The other end of the line went silent for a second, then a low hum. I've had my suspicions about him for years. What do you have? Shaq flipped open the folder, scanning the documents. Backdoor deals, shady partnerships. He's been using shell companies to overinflate property values and push out smaller businesses. And I got a list of officials he's been paying off, including a certain councilman who just blocked my project. The mayor let out a long sigh. Well, damn. You're telling me we've had a real estate kingpin running a rigged game under our noses? Shaq smirked. Not anymore. There was a pause before the mayor finally spoke again. I'll have my team start digging. If what you're saying checks out, Sterling's going to have a real bad week. Shaq's grip tightened around the phone. Make sure it's worse than that. The call ended. Shaq leaned back, folding his arms, the wheels already turning in his mind. Across town, Richard Sterling sipped his whiskey in his office, blissfully unaware that the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, investigators had already started pulling his records. It was only a matter of time. Richard Sterling's morning started like any other. An expensive suit, a fresh cup of coffee, and the arrogant certainty that he was untouchable. But as he settled into his plush leather chair, flipping open his laptop, the world around him came crashing down. The first thing he saw was the headline, bold and damning across the screen. Real estate tycoon, Richard Sterling under investigation for fraud corruption. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers, once steady, fumbled to refresh the page, hoping, praying it was some kind of mistake. But more headlines followed, one after another. City launches probe into illegal property deals. Whistleblower reveals years of bribes and backroom deals. Sterling Properties stock plummets 30% in morning trading. Richard's stomach twisted as he clicked on the article. Everything was there. His secret shell companies, the bribed city officials, even the zoning board corruption he'd used to block Shaq's purchase. Leaked documents, testimonies, emails. Someone had laid it all out, step by step. His phone buzzed violently against his desk. Richard, what the hell is going on? It was his top investor, his voice frantic. We're pulling out. Everyone's pulling out. Our shares are tanking. Richard's mouth went dry. Wait, don't do anything rash. I can fix this. But before he could say more, his secretary burst in, her face pale. Sir, the board is calling an emergency meeting. They want answers. Richard's hands trembled as he pushed back from his desk. Across town, Shaq leaned back with a satisfied grin, watching the news unfold. Told you, Sterling. You lost your king. The auction hall buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation as real estate moguls, investors, and developers filled the rows of seats. The stage was set. The grand property, the very one Richard Sterling had fought so hard to keep out of Shaq's hands, was finally up for grabs. Richard sat near the front, his jaw clenched, his suit slightly wrinkled from the stress of the past few days. He had lost everything, his reputation, his investors, and now his own company was slipping from his grasp. But this was his last shot at redemption. If he could win back this property, he could rebuild. The auctioneer took the stage, clearing his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's property auction. Up for bid is the Riverside Building, a prime real estate asset. We'll start the bidding at $2 million. Richard shot his hand up immediately. $2 million. A voice from the crowd countered smoothly. $3 million. Richard's head snapped toward the voice, but he couldn't place the bidder. The man wore a dark suit, a pair of glasses, and a baseball cap pulled low. His face was shadowed just enough to remain a mystery. Richard gritted his teeth. $4 million! The bidder barely hesitated. 5. Murmurs rippled through the audience. The stakes were climbing fast. Richard's heart pounded. He wasn't just fighting for the property anymore. He was fighting for his last shred of power. He inhaled sharply. $6 million. The room went silent, all eyes shifting to the unknown bidder. For a moment, Richard felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the man would back down. Then in a calm, unwavering voice, the bidder said, $10 million. Gasps echoed through the hall. Richard's stomach dropped. The price had jumped too high, too fast. He could barely scrape together $6 million, let alone 10. His hands trembled as he hesitated, the weight of his downfall sinking in. Going once, the auctioneer called. Richard swallowed, his mouth dry. Going twice. He gripped the edge of his chair, but he knew he had nothing left. Sold to bidder number 57. Applause filled the room as the anonymous buyer rose from his seat. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up, pulled off his cap, and removed his glasses. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he stared, horror washing over his face. Shaq grinned. Surprise. Richard's face turned ghostly pale as the room erupted in whispers. He had just lost to the very man he had tried to destroy. Cameras flashed, microphones lined the podium, and reporters whispered among themselves as they waited for the announcement. The energy in the air was electric, charged with curiosity. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the center of the stage, towering over the podium with his signature confidence. His tailored suit contrasted with the casual warmth of his smile as he scanned the eager faces before him. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today, Shaq began, his deep voice carrying across the courtyard of the newly acquired Riverside Building. I know there's been a lot of speculation about why I fought so hard for this property. Well, today, I'm here to clear things up. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the reporters, pens poised above their notepads, seemed to lean in. Shaq glanced over his shoulder at the massive structure behind him, a once decrepit apartment complex that had been neglected for years. This building has been a symbol of greed and exclusion for too long. Certain people wanted to keep it locked away, treating it like a trophy, while real families struggled to find a place to call home. In the back of the crowd, Richard Sterling stood stiffly, his jaw tight, arms crossed. He had avoided the press for days, humiliated after his failed attempt to outbid Shaq. Now he could only watch as the man he had tried to shut out commanded the moment with ease. Shaq continued, his voice firm but filled with emotion. Well, that changes today, because as of now, this building is being converted into free housing for struggling families. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by an eruption of applause. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Shaq smiled as he let the news sink in. We're not just giving people a roof over their head, he added. We're providing resources, job training, childcare, education support. This won't just be housing. It'll be a launch pad for families to build their futures. The crowd cheered. A mother holding her child wiped away tears, while an elderly man clapped so hard his hat nearly fell off. The atmosphere shifted from a press event to something bigger, something historic. Richard Sterling, still lingering in the background, felt his stomach churn. This wasn't just a business loss. This was personal. His legacy, his power, wiped out in a matter of seconds. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered under his breath, his face paling as cameras turned toward him, capturing his downfall. The press swarmed Sterling, reporters firing questions as his empire crumbled before his eyes. Richard Sterling had once been untouchable. A powerhouse in the real estate world, he had spent decades building an empire that towered over others. He controlled neighborhoods, dictated property values, and decided who was worthy of prime real estate. But in the span of a year, everything had collapsed. His company's name had become synonymous with fraud and corruption. The scandal Shaq exposed led to a full-blown investigation, costing Richard everything. His investors pulled out, his properties plummeted in value, and the lawsuits kept piling up. Eventually, Sterling Properties filed for bankruptcy. His luxurious mansion, the same one where he had hosted exclusive high society parties, now belonged to the bank. The Ferraris, the summer house in the Hamptons, the private golf memberships, all gone. Now Richard sat behind a cramped wooden desk in a mid-tier apartment complex, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt that had seen better days. The nameplate on his desk read, "Leasing Agent," a far cry from the CEO title he once flaunted. His days were now spent giving apartment tours, haggling over security deposits, and dealing with tenant complaints about leaky faucets. His fall from grace wasn't just financial, it was humiliating. Tenants recognized him from the news, some whispering as they passed by, others openly mocking him. "Damn, Sterling, didn't you used to own half the city?" One former associate had sneered just last week. Today, as he mindlessly scrolled through rental applications, the glass door of the leasing office swung open. Richard glanced up and froze. Standing in the doorway, towering as always, was Shaquille O'Neal. Dressed in a sleek suit, exuding the effortless confidence Richard had lost, Shaq stepped inside and casually glanced around the office. Richard swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He hadn't seen Shaq since that disastrous auction, the moment he lost everything. And now, of all places, he had walked into his office. Shaq smirked, placing both hands on the desk as he leaned in slightly. "Hey, man," he said, his deep voice laced with amusement. "Got any units available?" Richard's hands trembled as he realized his fate had come full circle. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. His once impeccable posture had collapsed under the weight of humiliation. He stared at Shaq, unable to mask the resentment flickering in his eyes. But behind that, there was something else. Defeat. "You're here to rub it in, huh?" Richard muttered, forcing a weak chuckle. His voice lacked the arrogance it once held. Shaq leaned back, crossing his massive arms. "Nah, man," he said casually, his deep voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Just wanted to see if you learned your lesson." Richard let out a slow breath and looked away. The office felt stifling, suffocating. Just a year ago, he had been at the top of the world, commanding wealth, respect, and power. Now he was nothing more than an employee, renting out the same kind of units he once looked down on. "Yeah," Richard finally admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I did." His shoulders slumped as the weight of the past year pressed down on him. "I lost everything because of my own greed, my reputation, my money, my company. All gone." He let out a hollow laugh. "Guess that makes me just another guy trying to make ends meet now." For a moment there was silence between them. Then Shaq nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said, standing up. He slid a thick envelope across the desk. Richard hesitated before picking it up. His fingers shook as he opened it. Inside was a check, a substantial one. His brows furrowed in confusion. What is this?" he asked cautiously. Shaq smirked. "An investment," he said simply. "Not for you, but for the people. That check is for the community center I built in Riverside, the one you tried to block." Richard's throat tightened. "I don't need your money," he said stubbornly, though his voice wavered. "It ain't about what you need," Shaq replied. "It's about what you owe." Richard looked down at the check, his reflection staring back at him from the glossy surface. He had spent years blocking people like Shaq from making a difference. Now he had the chance to help, if he chose to. Shaq turned to leave but paused at the door. He glanced back, flashing that signature grin. "Do some real good with your life, man." And with that, he walked out, leaving Richard alone with the weight of his choices. Richard stared at the check, realizing this was his last chance at redemption.